My husband announced he was divorcing me at our daughter's graduation, but started screaming when I've decided to start a new life without you. The words hung in the air of Morton's Steakhouse like smoke from extinguished candle. We'd gathered to celebrate our daughter's graduation from Duke University, and here was my husband of 24 years, standing with his champagne glass raised, making an announcement that had nothing to do with celebrating our brilliant daughter Brooklyn. Richard, my husband of 24 years, stood there in his navy blazer, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, delivering what should have been a toast to our daughter's achievements. Instead, he was serving me divorce papers disguised as a public declaration. The clinking of silverware ceased. Conversations halted mid-sentence. 43 pairs of eyes, I counted them later, darted between Richard and me, waiting for my reaction. Waiting for the tears, the shouting, the dramatic exit everyone expected from a blindsided wife. Instead, I smiled. "Congratulations on your honesty," I said, my voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "My name is Tinsley Morrison, and I am 49 years old." Until this moment, I had been playing the role of devoted wife and mother to perfection. I had put my own dreams of opening a boutique marketing firm on hold to support Richard through his corporate climbs, his midlife crisis career changes, and his endless phases of finding himself. I had raised our brilliant daughter Brooklyn, who sat beside me now in her cap and gown, her expression frozen in absolute horror. Her hazel eyes, my eyes, were wide with disbelief, her graduation cap slightly askew from when she jerked her head toward her father in shock. From my peripheral vision, I could see Vanessa Lauron, Richard's much younger girlfriend, shifting uncomfortably at the corner table where she sat with people I had considered friends for decades. The same friends who apparently knew about the affair but never thought to warn me. The same Vanessa who had attended our 4th of July barbecues, who had once asked me for advice about her struggling art gallery. With practiced calm, I reached into my Hermes handbag, a 25th anniversary gift from Richard last year, how ironic, and pulled out a sealed ivory envelope. I placed it gently beside his untouched filet mignon. "What's this?" he asked, his triumphant expression beginning to falter like a deflating balloon. "Something for you to read later," I replied, keeping my voice as level as a pilot announcing mild turbulence. I turned to Brooklyn, whose face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. I kissed her cheek, inhaling the familiar scent of her vanilla perfume. "I am so proud of you, sweetheart. This day is still about your incredible accomplishment." Then I stood, smoothed my navy dress, the one Richard had complimented that morning, and addressed our stunned guests with the grace of a seasoned hostess. "Please, everyone, enjoy your meal. I wish you all a lovely afternoon." With that, I walked out of Morton's Steakhouse, my heels clicking against the marble floor with the rhythm of a metronome. I held my head high, feeling those 43 pairs of eyes following my every step. The heavy glass door swung shut behind me, cutting off the beginning of anxious whispers and nervous throat clearing. Outside, the humid Atlanta heat hit me like opening an oven door, but I welcomed it. For the first time in years, I could breathe freely. Behind me, I heard the restaurant door burst open with the force of a man unraveling, followed by Richard's voice, no longer confident and controlled, but high-pitched and desperate. "Tinsley, what the hell is this? What have you done?" I kept walking toward the valet stand, allowing myself a small smile. The envelope I'd handed him contained the beginning of my revenge, one I'd been meticulously planning for months like a chess grandmaster thinking 10 moves ahead. You see, I had always been the practical one in our marriage. While Richard dreamed big and took calculated risks with our finances, I maintained the stability our family needed. I was the one who saved for Brooklyn's Duke tuition when Richard invested unwisely in his college buddy's tech startup. I was the one who worked overtime at my marketing director position at Hartwell & Associates when his midlife crisis led him to quit his stable job at IBM to chase his passion for craft brewing, a passion that lasted exactly 4 months before he grew bored. My own dreams of opening Morrison Marketing Solutions were perpetually shelved. After Brooklyn graduates, I told myself. After Richard finds his footing. Always after, never now. 3 months ago, I noticed discrepancies in our joint checking account. Small transfers, $500 here, $800 there, to an account I didn't recognize. Having managed our family finances for 2 decades, these irregularities stood out like red lipstick on a white shirt. I could have confronted Richard immediately. Any normal wife would have. But something held me back. Call it intuition, call it the growing distance between us that had been widening like a crack in a foundation. Instead, I began quietly investigating, using skills I'd honed during my 15 years in marketing research. What I discovered was worse than I had imagined. Richard had been systematically moving funds to a separate account for over 18 months. He had also been taking Vanessa to expensive restaurants, Canoe, The Optimist, Bacchanalia, purchasing jewelry from Tiffany & Company, and even looking at waterfront condos in Miami. All while telling me we needed to tighten our belts for retirement. Then came the text messages I discovered when Richard left his iPhone unlocked on the kitchen counter one Sunday morning. Messages that made my blood run cold and my resolve crystallize like ice. Can't wait to start our new life together after Brooklyn's graduation. Just have to get through the announcement. She'll be devastated, but she'll get over it. People always do. The Miami condo will be perfect for us. She'll never find us there. What Richard had forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood, was that I had been a marketing professional for over 20 years. I understood paper trails. I knew how to trace financial breadcrumbs. And most importantly, I remembered the prenuptial agreement we had signed 26 years ago. The irony was delicious. Richard had insisted on that prenup when we were young and I had more family money than he did. Fresh out of Emory's business school, he was paranoid about gold diggers and wanted to protect his future earnings potential. The agreement contained a fidelity clause that would prove to be his undoing. While Richard plotted his grand escape with Vanessa, I was building an airtight case. I consulted with the best divorce attorney in Atlanta. I documented every hidden transfer. I gathered evidence of their affair. I prepared divorce papers with the precision of a military operation. I timed everything perfectly, knowing Richard would want to wait until after Brooklyn's graduation to avoid ruining her big day. How thoughtful of him. What he didn't expect was that I would serve him divorce papers the morning of graduation, papers that were still sealed in court records, invisible to him until the moment I chose to reveal them. What Richard didn't know was that I was always 3 steps ahead, like a grandmaster playing chess against an amateur. I didn't return to Morton's Steakhouse. Instead, I drove my BMW X5 through the tree-lined streets of Buckhead to our home, a sprawling colonial revival that we'd purchased 12 years ago. The house that Richard had already promised to Vanessa, according to text messages he didn't realize I had seen. I parked in our circular driveway, beside the Japanese maple tree we'd planted when Brooklyn started high school. Everything looked exactly the same: the perfectly manicured lawn, the flowering azaleas, the brass mailbox with the Morrison family etched in elegant script. Yet everything had changed irrevocably. Inside, I climbed the curved staircase to our master bedroom and opened Richard's walk-in closet. His clothes were already packed in matching Louis Vuitton suitcases, hidden behind his winter coats like a guilty secret. Ready for his planned departure tomorrow morning. I smiled at his predictability. Richard had always been meticulous about his appearance but careless about the important things, like covering his tracks or remembering that his wife had a master's degree in business analytics. My phone buzzed incessantly. Messages from friends at the restaurant, from Brooklyn, even from Richard's brother David who had flown in from Phoenix for the graduation. I responded only to my daughter. I'm okay, sweetheart. This isn't your burden to carry. Enjoy your graduation day. We'll talk tonight. I love you more than words can say. I had protected Brooklyn from the truth for months, not wanting to overshadow her final semester at Duke with family drama. She would be angry that I hadn't confided in her, but I knew she would understand eventually. Brooklyn had inherited my analytical mind along with Richard's charm, a powerful combination that had helped her graduate summa cum laude. 3 hours later, I heard Richard's Mercedes sedan roar into the driveway like an angry beast. The front door slammed open with enough force to rattle the crystal chandelier in the foyer. Tinsley, he bellowed, his voice echoing through our 1,900-square-foot home. Where are you? I was sitting calmly in our living room, reviewing documents on my MacBook Pro like a CEO preparing for a board meeting. I closed it slowly as he stormed in, his face flushed burgundy with rage, that ivory envelope crushed in his trembling hand. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, waving the papers like a weapon. You served me with divorce papers today? Today, of all days. I thought the timing aligned nicely with your plans, I replied with the calm of someone who held all the cards. You wanted to start your new life. I'm simply helping facilitate that transition. His eyes narrowed. You had no right to. I had every right, I interrupted, my voice steady as a heartbeat. Just as you had every right to choose Vanessa over our marriage. We all make choices, Richard. Some are just more expensive than others. The prenup expired years ago, Richard said, his voice suddenly smug like a poker player revealing what he thought was a winning hand. Any lawyer will tell you that. It's been over 20 years. I allowed myself a small smile, the kind a chess player makes when their opponent walks directly into checkmate. Actually, it didn't expire. Section 12 specifically states that the fidelity clause remains in effect for the duration of the marriage, with no expiration date. Your attorney should have explained that to you. I paused, savoring the moment. Oh wait, you didn't consult one before planning your grand announcement, did you? The color drained from Richard's face like water from a broken dam. Reality was finally sinking in. The prenup he had insisted upon to protect his potential wealth would now cost him everything. His grand gesture at Morton's Steakhouse had just become the most expensive announcement of his life. You can't do this to me, Richard said, collapsing onto our cream-colored sectional like a deflated balloon. We built this life together. And you chose to end it, I replied, though my voice carried no malice, just the finality of a gavel. Just not in the way you planned. Richard's iPhone buzzed persistently in his pocket. He glanced at it, then ignored it with a grimace. Vanessa, no doubt, wondering where he was and why he wasn't following their carefully orchestrated escape plan. You've always been calculating, Tinsley, but this is cold, he said, trying a different strategy like a desperate salesman. What about our history? 24 years together means nothing. I studied him, this man I had loved for nearly a quarter century. The man who had held my hand through 2 miscarriages before we had Brooklyn. The man who had once surprised me with a weekend getaway to Savannah for our 10th anniversary, complete with a horse-drawn carriage ride through the historic district. When had he changed? Or had he always been this person, and I had been too devoted to see it? Our history meant everything to me, I answered truthfully. That's exactly why your betrayal cuts so deeply. His expression softened momentarily, perhaps sensing an opening like a shark smelling blood in the water. Then maybe we can fix this. I made a mistake. People make mistakes, Tinsley. Even after 24 years, people can change, can grow. This wasn't a mistake, Richard. This was a calculated plan spanning over 18 months. You systematically moved our money. You looked at Miami condos with her. You planned to announce our separation publicly to humiliate me in front of everyone we know. His face hardened again like concrete setting. You're exaggerating. It wasn't. Am I? I picked up my iPhone, opened the voice recording app, and played his own words back to him. Asterisk after the graduation dinner, I'll tell her it's over. A public setting is better. She won't make a scene in front of everyone. Asterisk. Then Vanessa's voice, clear as a bell, asterisk, and she has no idea about the Miami condo or the money you've been moving. Asterisk. Richard's voice again, asterisk none. Tinsley trusts me completely. That's always been her weakness. Asterisk. The blood drained from his face like he'd seen a ghost. You recorded our conversations? That's illegal. Not in Georgia when one party consents, I responded calmly. And not when it's recorded in your own home. I didn't violate your privacy with Vanessa. I'm not cruel. Just the conversations about your plans to defraud me. Richard stood suddenly, pacing like a caged animal. I need to make some calls. Of course. Your attorney might be a good starting point. I'll be staying at David's tonight, he said, referring to his brother. David's. I couldn't hide my surprise. I nodded slowly. He's quite upset with you, actually. He was the one who first spotted you and Vanessa together at the Ritz-Carlton bar last December. He didn't tell me immediately. He confronted you first, gave you a chance to end it. When he realized you had no intention of stopping, he came to me. This was another devastating blow Richard hadn't anticipated. David and I had always been close, but Richard never imagined his own brother would choose my side in this battle. Everyone's betraying me, he muttered like a child who couldn't understand why his toys were being taken away. Ironic, isn't it? I gathered my purse and the small overnight bag I had packed earlier with the efficiency of someone who had planned every detail. You have until tomorrow evening to remove your belongings from the house. After that, the locks will be changed. As I headed toward the front door, Richard called after me, desperation creeping into his voice like water through a cracked foundation. What about Brooklyn? Have you thought about how this affects her? I paused, anger finally breaking through my carefully maintained composure like a dam bursting. Don't you dare use our daughter as a shield, Richard. You certainly weren't thinking about her when you were planning your new Miami life with Vanessa. His iPhone buzzed again. This time he looked at it and groaned like a man facing his executioner. Problem? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Vanessa is at the apartment already. She's moved her things in. I couldn't help but smile. The apartment you put both your names on? The lease you signed last month. Richard nodded, looking confused as a lost tourist. You might want to check with the leasing office. That application was flagged for credit issues and never completed. The property manager called our home phone to verify information. I handled it myself. I walked out the front door, leaving Richard to face the first of many consequences. His perfectly planned new life was unraveling faster than a cheap sweater. I drove to David's house in Virginia Highland, a charming craftsman bungalow near Emory University where he taught economics. When I arrived, he greeted me with a fierce hug that reminded me why I'd always considered him the brother I never had. I just heard from Brooklyn, he said, pulling me inside where the smell of fresh coffee and his famous chili welcomed me like an old friend. Are you okay? I'm better than I expected, I admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he pressed into my hands. David's living room was exactly what you'd expect from a bachelor professor. Bookshelves lining every wall, a worn leather couch, and jazz playing softly from vintage speakers. It was the opposite of the pristine showplace Richard and I had created, and somehow that made it more comforting. I never thought Richard would make such a public spectacle, David said, settling into his favorite armchair. At the restaurant, in front of everyone, he's completely lost his mind. It was meant to humiliate me, I explained, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. A public rejection so I couldn't fight back without looking hysterical. David's face darkened with an anger I'd rarely seen from the typically mild-mannered professor. My brother always did have a flair for drama, but this is beyond anything I expected from him. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the day finally settling on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. What did you put in that envelope that made him so upset? David asked finally. I explained everything, the divorce filing, the evidence of his financial deception, and most importantly, the prenuptial agreement that would leave him with far less than he had planned. The prenup, David said, shaking his head with dark amusement. I remember when he insisted on it. You had just inherited that money from your grandmother, and he was so paranoid about protecting his future earnings potential. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. The irony is absolutely delicious. My phone rang. Brooklyn. I took a deep breath before answering. Hi, sweetheart. Mom, she said immediately, her voice strained with emotion. I'm coming over to Uncle David's. Honey, you don't have to. I'm already in the car, she interrupted. Dad is telling everyone you've lost your mind, that you've been planning this for months. He's saying horrible things about you. Of course he was. Richard always rewrote history to cast himself as the victim, like a politician spinning a scandal. Let him talk, I said calmly. The truth will become clear soon enough. 20 minutes later, Brooklyn arrived, still in her cap and gown but with her makeup smudged from crying. She fell into my arms like she used to as a child after a nightmare, and I held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice muffled against my shoulder. I didn't want to ruin your final semester at Duke, I explained, stroking her hair. You worked so hard for this achievement. She pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Well, Dad took care of ruining it anyway. The three of us moved to David's cozy living room, where Brooklyn finally heard the full story. I told her everything, how I had discovered the affair, the financial deceptions, the plans Richard and Vanessa had made without a thought for anyone but themselves. I knew something was off with Dad, Brooklyn admitted, curling up next to me on the couch. He's been different lately. Distracted. Always on his phone, always making excuses. But I never imagined this. None of us want to see these things in the people we love, David said gently, ever the wise professor. My phone buzzed with a text from Philip Chen, my attorney. The emergency filing had been approved. The joint accounts I had identified were frozen pending divorce proceedings. Richard now had access only to his personal account, enough for basic living expenses, but not nearly enough to follow through on the luxury purchases he had planned with Vanessa. I showed the message to David and Brooklyn. Good, Brooklyn said firmly, surprising me with her vehemence. He deserves every bit of it. My daughter's loyalty warmed my heart, but I wasn't naive about the complexities of family relationships. He's still your father, I reminded her gently. Your relationship with him is separate from what's happening between us. Brooklyn shook her head with the certainty of someone who had just seen behind the curtain. Maybe someday, but right now I can't even look at him. He hugged me this morning and told me how proud he was of me, all while planning to destroy our family hours later. The doorbell rang, interrupting our conversation. David went to answer it, returning moments later with a troubled expression that made my stomach tighten. It's Richard, he said quietly, and he's not alone. I steeled myself as David led Richard and Vanessa into the living room. Vanessa looked profoundly uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one foot to the other like a child who knew she was in trouble. Her eyes darted around the room, avoiding mine entirely. She was 36, not exactly a trophy wife, but still 15 years younger than me, with shoulder-length auburn hair and the kind of confidence that comes from never having faced real hardship. Richard, by contrast, looked furious. His earlier desperation had hardened into anger like molten metal cooling into steel. Tinsley, you need to stop this insanity, he demanded, his voice carrying the authority he was used to wielding in boardrooms. Unfreeze the accounts. We can discuss this like reasonable adults. Brooklyn stood up, placing herself slightly in front of me like a protective shield. Maybe you should have tried being reasonable before announcing to everyone that you were leaving Mom. Richard's eyes widened as if just noticing our daughter's presence. Brooklyn, this doesn't involve you. Doesn't involve me, she echoed, her voice rising with indignation. You blew up our family on my graduation day, and it doesn't involve me. Vanessa touched Richard's arm tentatively. Rick, maybe we should go. He shook her off like an annoying insect. No. I'm not leaving until Tinsley agrees to be rational about this. David folded his arms across his chest, every inch the protective brother-in-law. My sister-in-law seems to be the only rational person in this scenario. You're the one who created this mess, Richard. I remained seated, watching the drama unfold like a director observing a play. For years, I had been the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over conflicts and kept everyone happy. That role had been exhausting, and I had finally set it down like a heavy suitcase. The accounts will remain frozen until the preliminary hearing, I said calmly. That's in 3 days. The judge will determine appropriate asset division at that time. 3 days. Richard sputtered like a car engine that wouldn't start. What am I supposed to do for 3 days? You have your personal account, I reminded him. The one you've been funneling money into for the past 18 months. That should be sufficient for your immediate needs. Vanessa's head whipped toward Richard like she'd been slapped. You have a separate account? With how much money in it? An interesting dynamic was emerging. Clearly, Richard hadn't been entirely forthcoming with Vanessa about his financial situation either. The foundation of their relationship was already showing cracks. Richard ignored her question entirely. This is vindictive, Tinsley. This isn't like you. Perhaps you never really knew me, I replied. Just as I apparently never really knew you. Brooklyn turned to face Vanessa directly. Did you know he was going to announce it like that? At my graduation celebration. Vanessa had the decency to look ashamed, color rising in her cheeks. I thought he was going to talk to your mother privately. The public announcement today was unexpected. Richard shot her a look of pure betrayal. Even in his moment of crisis, he couldn't stand having his narrative questioned. I think you both should leave, David said firmly. You've upset Brooklyn enough for one day. Brooklyn, Richard pleaded, his voice taking on a wheedling tone. You understand that relationships change, don't you? Sometimes people grow apart. It's not anyone's fault. My daughter's face hardened in a way I had never seen before, transforming her from the sweet girl I knew into someone fierce and protective. What I understand is that you're a coward who couldn't even give Mom the dignity of a private conversation. What I understand is that you were stealing from our family while I was working 2 jobs to help pay for textbooks because you said money was tight. Richard paled. That's not how it. It's exactly how it was. Brooklyn cut him off with surgical precision. Please leave, Dad. I can't look at you right now. The silence that followed was deafening. broken only by the soft ticking of David's grandfather clock and the distant sound of traffic outside. Finally, Richard turned to go, Vanessa trailing behind him like a reluctant shadow. At the door, he paused and looked back at me with eyes that held a mixture of anger and something that might have been regret. "This isn't over, Tinsley. I'll fight you on this." I met his gaze steadily, unafraid. "You're welcome to try." After they left, Brooklyn collapsed next to me on the sofa, tears streaming down her face like rain on a window. "I've never talked to Dad like that," she whispered. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her close. "Sometimes standing up for what's right is painful, sweetheart. But it's still right." David brought us fresh cups of coffee, his movements gentle and purposeful. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his mug. "To new beginnings," I agreed, thinking that this ending was really just the beginning of something I had never dared to imagine. 6 months later, I stood in the gleaming offices of Morrison Marketing Solutions, watching the Atlanta skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. My company, my dream finally realized, occupied the entire 15th floor of a Buckhead high-rise, with a team of 12 talented professionals who shared my vision of ethical, innovative marketing. The divorce had been finalized 2 months ago. The judge upheld the prenuptial agreement in its entirety, just as I had known she would. Richard left with his personal possessions, his struggling craft brewing business, and the money from his private account, which, after paying his attorney fees and settling debts, was barely enough to secure a modest apartment in Midtown. I retained our Buckhead home, my retirement accounts, and 70% of our joint investments, exactly as the prenuptial agreement stipulated in cases of marital infidelity. The justice was poetic. The very document Richard had insisted upon to protect himself had become his financial undoing. Vanessa had disappeared from his life within 3 weeks of the courthouse confrontation, reportedly now dating a successful orthopedic surgeon she'd met at a charity gala. Richard's grand promises of a luxury lifestyle had evaporated like morning mist when the reality of his financial situation became clear. Most of our mutual friends had quietly distanced themselves from Richard once the full story of his deception became known. Atlanta's social circles can be unforgiving to those who violate the unspoken codes of conduct, and Richard's public humiliation of his wife had crossed several lines. My business thrived beyond my wildest expectations. I specialized in helping companies navigate major transitions, mergers, rebranding, crisis management. My first major client was a tech startup founded by 3 brilliant women who needed help positioning themselves in a male-dominated industry. Word of mouth brought more clients, and within 4 months, I had to hire additional staff to keep up with demand. The work was immediately fulfilling in a way my corporate position never had been. I was building something with my own hands, using skills I had honed over 20 years but never fully applied to my own dreams. Brooklyn visited often, proud of what I had accomplished. She had moved to Charlotte for her marketing position with a sustainable fashion company, but she drove down to Atlanta every other weekend. "You know what's ironic," she said during one visit, sitting in my corner office with its view of Stone Mountain in the distance. "If Dad had just been honest from the beginning, he might have kept half of everything." "Sometimes people can't see beyond what they want in the moment," I replied, thinking of how Richard's greed had ultimately cost him far more than honesty ever would have. I heard through David that Richard had tried to restart his craft brewing business, but without my financial acumen and support, he was struggling to secure investors. His reputation in Atlanta's business community had suffered, and starting over at 53 was proving more challenging than he had anticipated. I felt no satisfaction in his struggles, only a kind of peaceful closure. The woman who had once defined herself as Richard's wife and Brooklyn's mother had discovered a new identity: mentor, business owner, and advocate for other women navigating major life transitions. The envelope I had handed Richard at Morton's Steakhouse hadn't just contained my escape plan, it had been the key to a door I never knew existed. Behind that door, I found not just revenge, but reinvention. In securing my financial future, I had also reclaimed something far more valuable: myself. Last week, I received an unexpected visitor. Richard appeared at my office reception desk, looking older and more worn than I remembered. His once perfect hair was now more grey than brown, and his expensive suits had been replaced by off-the-rack clothing that didn't quite fit properly. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" he asked, his voice lacking its formal authority. I agreed, more from curiosity than kindness. We sat in my office, the same room where I now made decisions that affected dozens of employees and millions of dollars in client accounts. "I wanted to apologize," he said simply. "I know it's too late, and I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed to say it." I was wrong. About everything. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving motives, but found only genuine remorse. I hope you find happiness, Richard, I said finally. I really do. He nodded, understanding that this was closure, not reconciliation. You deserve all the success you found, Tinsley. You always were the stronger one. As he left, I felt the last threads of anger and resentment dissolve like sugar in rain. The man who had once been my entire world was now just someone I used to know, someone whose choices had inadvertently led me to discover my own strength. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my Buckhead home, looking out over the city lights of Atlanta. Brooklyn was visiting for the weekend, and I could hear her laughing on the phone with her boyfriend, planning their future with the optimism of youth. My phone buzzed with a text from a potential client, a woman starting over after her own divorce, looking for help launching a consulting firm. I smiled and typed back a response. Tomorrow, I would help another woman discover that endings can be beginnings in disguise. The envelope that had started it all was now framed in my office, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories come from the courage to stop playing a role that no longer fits. In losing the life I had planned, I had found the life I was meant to live.